Hello, I'm Steve Weberg. I'm with the public affairs staff of the Kansas City Public Library, and I want to thank you for joining us this evening. We've got a timely discussion revolving around an absolutely fascinating book by two exceptional reporters, Michael Graff and Nick Ochsner. We're now, a little more than 8 months from the 2022 midterm elections. This time, 4 years ago, in 2018, the clock was ticking on one of the most significant cases of voting fraud in our country's history. It happened in southeastern North Carolina and resulted in the decertification of a congressional election and the calling of a new election in the state's 9th district. The Republican who initially won the seat chose not to run in the new election. The political operative at the center of the scandal has refused a plea deal and is approaching trial finally. Now, of course, election integrity has emerged since then as one of the most charged issues in American politics. Our previous president continues to claim massive voter fraud in 2020, claiming that the election was stolen. And that rhetoric fueled the storming of the U.S. Capitol building the following January 6th. Lawsuits related to those claims have largely been thrown out of court, and audits, most notably in Arizona, found very little, if any, evidence of voter fraud. But there's a large segment of the public that still is skeptical that Joe Biden legitimately won the presidency. And conservative lawmakers in a number of states are moving to amend voting protocols in the name of preventing fraud. Whichever side you do take now, there was no ambiguity in North Carolina's 9th district in 2018. Fraud, in this case, illegal ballot harvesting, was committed in a race decided by 0.3 of a percentage point, 905 votes out of nearly 283,000 cast. Michael Graff and Nick Ochsner covered the scandal. Michael is a reporter at Axios Charlotte. Nick is the chief investigative reporter at CBS television affiliate WBTV in Charlotte, North Carolina. And they've dug deeply into the saga in their book, The Vote Collectors, the true story of the scamsters, politicians, and preachers behind the nation's greatest electoral fraud. And it really is more than an account of election fraud. Michael and Nick flesh out a very telling backstory. They use that 2018 scandal as a jumping off point to get into a very troubled history of politics and race in that district and in the area. This is a particular story that played out in North Carolina. The looming question, of course, is where else has it happened without being uncovered? And also, do we feel good that the system eventually worked in the 9th district in North Carolina, or are we more disturbed that it took so long to work? And what if it hadn't? Now, if you have a question for Michael and Nick over the course of the discussion, you can submit it via the YouTube live chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. And I right now want to welcome Michael, Nick, and I wish you guys were in person with us tonight, but it's great to have you with us virtually. And looking forward to visiting with you and hearing you all talk here for a little bit at the outset.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Can we just take you with us everywhere we go? What a good hype man. And what a nice summary of the book. So thanks for being here. I guess we don't have like nameplates or anything else. So I'm Nick Ochsner. This is Michael Graff. And we appreciate you guys tuning in to hear us talk. Probably the most important thing that we should talk about first, because it's really central to the book, is the place of Bladen County. So Michael, do you want to start by just unpacking for us a little bit about Bladen County?
Yeah, we're sitting in Charlotte now. It's the biggest city in North Carolina, and it's the largest city in the Carolinas as a whole. It's like 200 miles east of here. The North Carolina coast is 250 miles east of here. This place is 200 miles east of here. So it's in that place, so it's in that stretch of road where you're just like, I can't wait to freaking get there. Like, I can't wait to get to the beach. And so most people are plowing through there, just trying to get to where they're
Or
going.
they might stop literally for the only claim to fame in Bladen County is a hamburger place called Melvin's. And that is literally maybe the only reason someone stopped in Bladen County between Charlotte and
For $3.99, you can get a flat top burger. Yeah. And I'm proud to report I've eaten many of Melvin's hamburgers, and I don't think Nick has.
Don't tell anyone. I've had 0. I grew up 30 minutes from there. I've had 0 Melvin's hamburgers.
But yes, so it's this place. It's this place on the way to something, or it's this place at the end of the world, if you want to see it that way. But Bladen County used to be called the Mother County. The first European settlers in North America called it the Mother County in North Carolina. And it was that way because Bladen County used to stretch from that spot in the sandy hills of eastern North Carolina, which used to be the ocean floor, actually, many millions of years ago, all the way to the stone tops of the Great Smoky Mountains. So that used to be Bladen County, and it used to cover Charlotte and everything like that. And over time, the settlements, they just chopped up the state, and now we have 100 counties, and Bladen County is one of them.
Still really big.
It's still really, really big. 30-some thousand people live there, and it's 800 and some, I think, square miles. Is that right?
Yeah.
So folks are spread out in a lot of different places, dirt roads. It's wonderful to drive through. I mean, there you can drive for days and see soybean fields and hog farming operations and things like that. The largest hog farming operation in the United States is based in Bladen County, Smithfield Farms, and that presents all sorts of issues with labor and things like that. But this is a place that used to thrive on agriculture. And in the 1800s, it thrived on tar and turpentine to make naval ships, naval supplies, and things like that. But today, it doesn't really thrive on anything right now. And to Nick, it's a very personal place. It's the county next door to where he grew up. I happened to work at the Fayetteville Observer when I was early in my career as a newspaper reporter. Nick grew up in Fayetteville. Our favorite story is that we crossed paths at that time. I was a working, salaried, on my own
adult,
and Nick was a 16-year-old high schooler, and that's how.
Literally down the street from the newspaper at a high school.
So now we're on this tour. Nick reminds me that I'm much older than him all the time. But
I think it's important. You have to understand the story of what happened in 2018, right? This didn't happen in a vacuum.
No.
And so you have to understand where it happened and the conditions that allowed it to happen, right? So as Michael described, you've got this intensely rural place where the people who live there are intensely impoverished, right? There's opioid epidemic is rampant there just as well as it is anywhere else. They're kind of desperate for work in a lot of ways, but they're still intensely proud of where they live. The other thing we haven't mentioned yet is it's also de facto kind of still self-segregated. Race is very much a factor everywhere you go in Bladen County. And race is very prevalent, much more than it would be really probably anywhere else that I've ever been, I think. And that's one of the things that hit you in the face as you get to Bladen County. My first time down there as a reporter, because life's a little different when you show up with a camera and a microphone somewhere compared to when you go to Boy Scout camp there as a kid. My first time down there as a reporter, one of the first things I noticed was how just palpable race and racial tensions are. And that underscored for decades, if not centuries before 2018, underscored life in Bladen County. And I think we can't talk about this book without talking about that.
Absolutely not. I mean, this is Eastern North Carolina. This is, King's, what we in North Carolina call King's Grant land, where some families still have land that was granted to them by the king. and that was passed down from generation to generation. And then there are, of course, many, many families who didn't have anything passed down from generation to generation. So the legacy of slavery and things like that still exists there, because communities they're not divided by, you know, roads or things like that. They're 20 and 30 miles apart. You're talking. So when we start to go down there, Nick and I, to start reporting, he was reporting for a TV station, I'm reporting for Politico magazine. Folks start saying to us, well, over there in the black district, or over there in the white district. And you're like, wow, like people just are saying this right to us. Like in it. And so you respect that in a lot of ways, because it makes things in some ways more clear. And so that's when Nick and I decided, you know, we knew we had an interesting story about fraud, but mostly what we wanted to do was tell a story about a place in America today where the fact is that years and years of segregation have contributed to a divide and a constant fighting for the next rung in local politics. As we get in the book, the most important race in the book, Nick, I mean the most important office in the book has nothing to do with the central race and the congressional district race. I mean, the most important political office in Bladen County is certainly not congressman.
No, it's sheriff. Right. We're talking about Bladen County 9th congressional district because it upended a congressional race, but really politics in Bladen County is intensely local, right? It all centers really around a race for sheriff, but I think you would agree with me that really the other big race that sparked the match that led us to 2018 is a race for soil and water conservation supervisor. Right? Yeah. I mean, so it's several sheriff's races and a race for soil and water conservation district supervisor are the races that led to a congressional race being thrown out. And it feels that way because the stakes, the stakes are so high about something so intensely local because you have a group of people who don't really feel like they've got a voice in Raleigh, our state capital, North Carolina, or certainly in Washington. And so what's a congressman, right? The would-be congressman who almost got elected to Congress, a guy named Mark Harris, the Republican. One of the reasons the people in Bladen County arguably liked him so much is because he actually came there and talked to them. Yeah. And it is clear when you talk to Mark Harris that he really likes the people of Bladen County and still likes the people of Bladen County. And he ran against a Democrat named Dan McCready. Both of them live in Charlotte. Both of them polished people. Mark Harris, a Baptist preacher, one of the biggest churches in North Carolina, certainly one of the biggest churches in Charlotte. Dan McCready, the son of a lawyer, a Marine, energy investor, one of those kind of American-made dudes who's a great, moderate, middle-of-the-road Democrat. And if anyone was going to be successful in that district as a Democrat, it's going to be him. And it was unusual for Bladen County, which, like Michael said, I mean, it's a 2.5 hour drive from where we are right now. And we're in the population center, to be clear. It was unusual for the candidates to take that drive all the way down there. And yet Mark Harris did, and he did it with the help of a guy named McCrae Dallas, who we should probably talk about a little bit. I'm sure we'll talk about him more in the Q&A. Why don't you tell us a smidge about McCrae?
McCrae is one of the, I've interviewed a lot of interesting people. I've been a journalist for 22 years now. So I've interviewed multiple presidents, many folks who've, lived in many different situations, from millionaires to homeless folks. And McCrae is top of the list, one of the most interesting people I've ever met. And part of it, and I think the central theme of our book, and as we talked about earlier, the central theme of our book is truth, and what to believe and what not to believe, and the importance of truth, and importance of not spreading lies. And this one character gets at the natural instinct to tell a lie for personal gain better than probably anybody I've ever interviewed, because there were many times we interviewed him on the record, on tape for more than 40 hours. Nick talked to him many other times just in phone calls and stuff like that on the road. But over 40 hours of tape, there were many times when we all of a sudden thought, well, are we characters in this book? Like are we getting played? Because he was only letting us interview him. We had another reporter down there, a fantastic reporter from This American Life, Zoe Chase, who was dying to get interviews with him. But for some reason, he had promised Nick and me that we would be the only ones he talked to for this book. And so that raises, first of all, you're like, okay, that's nice. But then it raises a lot of red flags. Like, okay, why does he think he can play us? And so there were times when we had to try to call him on his BS.
It's he's the reason that I knew we had a book, I think. McCrae's also the first person in Bladen County I talked to for this story, surprisingly. And to probably back up half a second, McCrae Dallas is the political operative at the center of the scandal. He was hired by Mark Harris, the Republican, to kind of be his local guy on the ground, I guess, in Bladen County and in some of the surrounding counties down there. But McCrae, by all intents and purposes, is the go-to political dude in Bladen County. He used to work for Democrats, then he started working for Republicans, and he kind of became the nemesis of this group, this Black voting group called the Bladen County Improvement Association, this Black political action committee that rose out of this great tradition we have in North Carolina of these Black political action committees that started in the 1950s as a way to organize and get some level of Black political power. And they were successful, so they spread all across the state. And so you have the Bladen County Improvement Association that's doing its thing in Bladen County. McCrae actually learned from them, and then kind of spun off, and they became nemesis. And it was that desire to beat each other, really, that blew up into what we saw happen in 2018. And so McCrae worked for Mark Harris. Probably interesting to everyone that they first met in a furniture store owned by the chairman of the county commission in Bladen County, who later told me they had the meeting in his store because, quote, can you think of a more comfortable place to have a meeting? And so Mark Harris, this Baptist preacher, I think we refer to him in the book as the preacher with the good hair, this kind of slick guy from the big city, drives to Bladen County for the first time because he ran for Congress in 2016 and barely lost in the primary to the incumbent. So he wants to run again in 2018. This is April of 2017 when he's feeling out whether or not he should run again. And this guy who's a judge from the area, a very powerful judge in the state, says, you need to go meet with this guy. So at the urging of a judge, he drives to this discount furniture store in Bladen County, in Elizabethtown, right down the street from Melvin's Hamburgers. And he meets with the chairman of the county commission and the chairman of the Republican Party and McCrae Dallas. And Pat Melvin was there, right? Yeah. Pat Melvin, whose family started Melvin's Hamburgers, and Pat sold it and cashed in on the family's name in several ways. And so you've got some of the certainly the richest man in Bladen County, in Pat Melvin, and you've got some of the most powerful folks sitting on these sofa love sets and talking about running for Congress. And that's a strange start to a political campaign.
Yeah, very, very strange. And I think one of the interesting things is that the congressional candidates like Mark Harris, like many of us, I think, I grew up in a rural area, but now I live in Charlotte, and I like to think I can go back there and everything is just the same, but it's not. You think you step into Mark Harris grew up in a rural area, but you step into a place and you think, well, I know folks, I know folks who farm and things like that. But Mark Harris stepped into a situation that he did not know was happening. He did not know that all of this, there was a lot of, he certainly did not anticipate 120 or so years of back and forth between between black voters and white voters that was actually going to drive this fraud scandal that he would be embroiled in. So I mean, I do think that it's one of those. It's also a wonderfully interesting story, I think, of city folks underestimating folks in that area, underestimating. We have one of the Nick and I we published this book in November of last year, and when we were talking about it then. But since then, one of the interesting things that's happened is that there have been these 2 new Netflix shows that have come out about scam artists. It's like the Tinder swindler and like they're all very modern scams that involve Instagram and things like that. This was a scam that was all done on pen and paper.
Yeah, good old fashioned. Yeah, there's nothing technologically advanced about it. And we should point out a little bit that while McCrae Dallas is the guy who's still charged with with election fraud, state criminal charges for election fraud, there is ample evidence that both McCrae Dallas and the Bladen County Improvement Association and other people who are neither of those two carried out activities that would be illegal, that are illegal under the law. McCrae is the only person charged with that stuff, we should say. And so I think we've been rambling for about 20 minutes. I think Steve might have some questions for us, I hope. And the audience might have some questions for us. So probably a good time to stop talking and listen to what y'all want to hear about.
I hope we said
I wish we had more than, 30 to 40 minutes, because I think we could talk several hours on this. I mean, first of all, can you guys just touch a little bit on specifically what it was that Dallas did? How did he turn the election?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and so it's important to first say that voting, because Bladen County, we talked about how big it is, and we talked about how rural it is, and that means people are spread out. And so there are 2 ways that kind of came about to get people to the polls. The first way is on election day or during early voting, by driving a car around or a van around and loading people up in that van and maybe giving them a campaign flyer on who to vote for and sending them into the polls. And as long as you're not paying people for their votes, that's totally legal. That's called hauling. But the other way, and the primary way, and McCrae does that, the Improvement Pact does hauling, lots of people do hauling. But the primary way that people vote in Bladen County or get out to vote in Bladen County is by using absentee ballots. And that's much more labor intensive. First, and this is what McCrae and the Improvement Pact would do. So first you get a staff of people and you got to drive around all over Bladen County and you got to knock on their doors to these people, to these voters who you think are likely to support your candidates. And McCrae's been doing this for so long that he knows you could drive down the road with him. He'd tell you who lives there, who their mom and daddy is, who their cousins are, who they voted for in the last 5 elections. And so McCrae builds these lists of people that he needs to target and gets a staff of people that he pays $10 a head. There's a cat that just entered the shot, so let's see how long before you see it. There's the kitty tail. Pardon us. And he gets these people to go around and request or get these voters to request an absentee ballot. So that's step 1. And then you got to wait for the ballots to be mailed. And so after the ballots are mailed to these people, you go back to their house. And here's where the rub is. Depending on what version of the story you're being told, either is people go, hey, make sure to fill out your ballot. Need any help? Because at the time, you needed 2 witness signatures. And then you seal it before you could seal it and put it in the mail. Need us to witness for you? And then they would just leave. What the illegal thing would be is, one, if someone signed it as a witness who didn't actually witness it. And then 2, and the biggest part, the harvesting part, is when these people, the allegation is that McCrae's workers would take the ballot from the voter and put it in the mail. I don't know that we've seen any hard evidence one way or the other. We have lots of people who've said that, but just like McCrae is a pretty unreliable guy, convicted of insurance fraud, everyone in Bladen County lies about something. That's just, the truth is pretty optional in Bladen County for most people. And so it's that is the allegation, and that's the activity.
and this might be just a matter of semantics, but the popular term is voter fraud, but this is more properly termed election fraud, right? Talk about the difference.
The difference is that it's an operation, not one voter. So I think a lot of times when we talk about voter fraud, when we hear it pop up in the news or when we hear politicians make accusations of it, it's that a person who is voting illegally for whatever reason, because in that state, perhaps maybe a convicted felon is not allowed to vote, or in that state, an undocumented immigrant is not allowed to vote. And so there are accusations that folks who shouldn't be voting under the state law are voting. And that's on the individual. So that implies that, that claim implies that thousands of individuals are doing this in a way that would change an election. Election fraud, though, is actually an operation that is carried out by folks who treat it like a job, who treat it like it's kind of like kind of joked, it's like the Uber Eats of voting, where it's like you're it's a scam to get a lot of votes. Like one or two people are scamming to get a lot of votes in piles for their candidate or against a candidate, and so that's the difference. And so in some ways it's like there's a manager, and in our case, like McRae would be the manager of this, and the head of the Bladen Improvement Association would be the manager of that operation. So it's just different. It's a scheme.
It's a good spot here for an audience question that came in. Do you think there are any elements of that operation that might be able to scale to a scale that would influence a state or national election?
Well, it's also interesting that what McRae was doing isn't all that different, except for the part that might include, illegally collecting a ballot, isn't all that different from what these sophisticated political operations in Washington, D.C. and around the country are doing, right? He's making lists of voters. He's targeting the voters that he thinks are going to support his candidate. And then he's going out to get the vote. And he did it all on paper and pencil, not without any computers. But in some ways, that's what he's doing. Now, the rub becomes how many groups like this are operating in rural areas because you've got to have people for who a day's work of $80 or $100 is worth it, right? That's what is required. You've got to have some sort of level of desperation or economic depression where you can find people willing to essentially go and break the law and do allegedly illegal things for not a whole lot of money. And that tends to be in places in the shadows that are often overlooked and marginalized. And so in some ways, I'm sure this isn't the only political operation out there. Bladen County wasn't the only place where this was happening. And it's harder to know because how often are we really looking for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incredibly hard to pull off because you'd have to have a whole lot of people who are willing to carry on the lie. So that's also a different, the reason this came up, okay? So Bladen County had been operating this way for a long time. People have been, there have been allegations of 200 votes here or there for a long time. It only mattered when this election was decided, 60,000 votes were cast and it was separated by 905 votes. I mean, it only mattered because the election was close enough. And even then, I mean, the number of ballots in question barely was enough to have possibly flipped the election. So it is. I think the ultimate point of our book is not to say that people. I know we agree on this. People shouldn't not trust elections, but in order to stop election fraud from happening, you have to chase actual allegations, and you have to just have your eyes open to what folks are capable of doing.
Well, and Michael makes a really interesting point that we have to underscore here too, is there had been complaints about shenanigans. It's a word that people said about this book and what was going on. I love that word. There had been complaints about and allegations of shenanigans in elections in Bladen County for decades. I mean, dating back to when I grew up down there. And in fact, when this all first broke, I tried to ignore it, and I didn't plan to cover it because this had been alleged year in and year out, as recently as in 2016, the election before the 2018 race, where the then governor was kind of using McCrae Dallas and some allegations of voter fraud or election fraud as a last-ditch effort to try to resurrect a victory in the 2016 race. But no one had ever really taken it seriously and done the level of in-depth investigation that we saw in 2018. And frankly, I didn't expect it to happen again in 2018 either. And then it did, because the stakes were so high and the margins were so low.
You guys know, is this the only case of an election being overturned because of fraud?
At least in Congress, yeah, in modern history, yeah. Yes, that's, that was kind of the main point of our book is, you're like, okay, this is the only time this has ever happened, so let's talk about how it happened.
Well, if you read the subtitle here, we call it the greatest electoral fraud, and frequently people say, well, why is it the greatest? And we say, because it's the only one we know about.
The whole thing is interesting, among other things, because both sides of the aisle could find something about this that suited their political purposes. Can you talk about that for a minute?
I'll say that's been one of the more frustrating parts of the book release, actually, over the past 3 months, is that folks are picking the parts that they like. And folks are picking the parts of the story that suit their story and turning it into, well, voter fraud happens or election fraud happens, and you know what? You just can't trust elections. And that's certainly not part of the story. That's certainly not the story. Or there are folks who are saying, well, look at it's just Republicans doing it. And of course, that's not the point of our book. So it's an interesting, sometimes I think folks, obviously we know that now. I mean, this is like modern America. This is all like very clear. People read what they want to, they see what they want to. And so they have read our book, and there are some folks who have read our book and completely missed
the point.
Some of the points of the book. Or take it, not maybe, but they've taken parts, they've blown up parts of the book that maybe that weren't there. I mean, we have very clear evidence that there was, this case file from 2016. The Board of Elections in North Carolina sent a case file to the U.S. Attorney in Eastern North Carolina and said, look into Bladen County. Please, please, please look into Bladen County. And we have very clear evidence that the U.S. Attorney did not look at that file for 2 years. He let it sit on his desk. And while he was doing it, he was investigating 12 to 18 cases of supposedly undocumented immigrants voting in minor misdemeanor cases and missing and not investigating 400 or so possible ballots.
Was that misplaced priorities, or was that politically motivated?
Oh, I mean, this was a Trump-appointed U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of North Carolina, and had a meeting with the State Board of Elections, with the State Board of Elections director and the general counsel, who compile a 300-page dossier outlining shenanigans and very illegal things from both Republicans and Democrats. This was not a partisan thing, and begged and pleaded and stood on their heads. I mean, I think they did everything but dance naked in their underwear down the street in front of the office to try to get the U.S. attorney to do something about this. And they didn't do anything about it. They didn't do anything about it when they submitted this. And so the result was what we saw in 2018. It is a reminder that democracy is not broken, elections aren't broken, but this is what happens when the system doesn't work like it's supposed to. The system of laws. We have laws in place to keep absentee ballots a secure way of voting. We have laws in place to make sure every vote counts. But when those laws are broken and no one does anything about it, the system breaks down. And when the system breaks down, you have what we saw in 2018. And it was broken, and the breakdown happened bit by bit by bit over a period of decades.
one quick interlude here. You just used the word shenanigans again. I love that word too. But it has inspired an inquiring mind to ask the name of the cat.
Is Mr. T. He is my mother-in-law's cat, who's a U.S. diplomat. He came from Algeria, and he is a very curious guy. So sorry if he's distracting, but he has to come up and see what's going on.
YouTube is made for cats and little kids, cats and dogs and little kids.
There are also 2 dogs in this house that let's see. The night is, we got 25 minutes left, right? Let's see if they make an appearance too.
Again, McCrae Dallas, you really couldn't draw up a better character for a novel, for a work of fiction than him. And I would kind of invite people to just Google him. He even looks interesting in appearance to me. So what is his backstory? How did he get to, where he was by 2016, 2018?
So he is every bit as interesting as he looks and as you think he is. And so McCrae is a son of Bladen County. He was born, he is the only child of a marriage that is made up of people who came to the marriage with a lot of children.
Yeah.
How many kids?
He was the youngest
of
maybe 8 or 9.
Yeah, a lot of kids. We've named them in the book. You should buy the book to read it. And
he says that he grew up on a dirt road so far back that you had to ship sunshine in. Like, I'll never forget it saying that.
And he didn't, the house he lived in until he was 5 didn't have running waters. They didn't have indoor plumbing until they moved to the big city of Bladenboro off the farm into a house with toilets and running water. And he said he was amazed. So he had this upbringing. His dad, he describes as being a pretty strict man, generally speaking, with his brothers and sisters. But McCrae, being the youngest, was able to get things by the old man a little bit, or get a little pity from the old man sometimes, a little more than he would give, a little more grace, you could probably say, than his siblings got. And that, to me, is kind of instructive for the kind of person McCrae became. We describe him in the book, and this came from someone who knows him really well, who I won't name because he'd be, I think, offended if he knew about it. But we call him in the book a flim-flam man, which is based off a novel. And the flim-flam man kind of comes. He's a scamster, you might say, kind of a huckster. Yeah. And his whole life was kind of, what can I do to get ahead a little bit, to make a little more money, to get a better situation for me a little bit. He was convicted in the 80s of insurance fraud because a woman he was engaged to, trying to marry, who he ultimately did marry, suggested that they take out an insurance policy on a worker of McCrae's. McCrae owned a used car lot at the time. And he had a kid working for him who got in a car wreck and died. And a day or two later, an insurance salesman came to the house and they took out a policy on him and cashed the policy. And after he had, was flush with cash, this woman married him. And they went on a honeymoon to Vegas, if I recall. Yeah. And so he was convicted of insurance fraud for that. And that really is the impetus and the inspiration for him to get into politics, because he thought he was prosecuted more vigorously than his wife at the time. He's been married a lot. And so he wanted to run, or he wanted to unseat the district attorney. And so that's how and why he got into politics.
It seems pretty fitting. Catch us up with him right now. He's up for trial, what, in August?
Yeah, on his state charges are currently set for trial in August. He separately pleaded guilty late last year to federal Social Security disability fraud. And he was supposed to have reported to prison in early December. He is in very, very bad health and continuing to deteriorate health-wise. And so his prison sentence in the federal prison was delayed from December till April. I actually haven't talked to him in a while, which is unusual. But last I checked, he continues to be in bad health. And so it's not clear how that's going to play out.
And what about Mark Harris, who initially won the election? As you mentioned, a former pastor. Is he still in politics? Did he get out? Did he go back to the ministry?
I'll lead with the most interesting thing and the most timely thing. His son just filed today for a state House of Representatives seat. So yeah. the Harris family political business continues. Mark Harris is a pastor of a church in the Lake Norman area, which is where a bunch of NASCAR drivers live. He's a pastor there, but he still, I think it's fair to say, stays active in politics and current events.
That wasn't where he was during this. He was living in South Charlotte. So he moved to the lake, as we say here, and he moved up there and became a pastor at a church there. Still fairly involved, and we just had our congressional districts redrawn for the 30th or so time yesterday, so we don't exactly, but there's always rumors that Mark might try to jump into a race depending on how the districts are drawn. I don't know if the new districts shape up very well for him, but he kind of watches. And so Nick mentioned his son, that's a whole, another 10-minute explainer on
who actually comes across, I think, somewhat virtuously in this, doesn't he?
Yes.
He's the one who at the hearing for this fraud case stood up and said, yes, I did warn my father not to hire McRae Dallas. And that contradicted what his father had said previously, which is that nobody had warned me not to hire him. And his own son, stood on the stand and said, I did warn him. And here are the emails that showed.
Yeah, more importantly, here are all the emails in detail. And you can read the book and know exactly what he told his father over and over again. Yeah.
Do you believe Harris's insistence that he didn't know Dallas was doing anything illegal?
Yeah, it's pretty clear. Now, we can talk about whether or not he should have known or could have known, but there's no evidence to suggest that he did know what McRae was doing. I think it is fair to say that Mark Harris is either a little gullible or was so blinded by the prospect of winning an election that he didn't ask more questions or readily accepted McRae's word for how he operated and what he did. But I mean,
that's another cautionary tale from the book. I went in as skeptical as anybody about Mark Harris when we talked to him, and I walked out and I said, he really believes this. He truly believes he did nothing wrong. But here are 1,000 points in time where he should have known he did something wrong. So Mark is either, like Nick said, really gullible, or he's a bad manager. There are many political candidates who would say, if you don't know this is happening, then you're just a bad manager of a campaign. You're not a good overseer of a campaign. The manager of Walmart should know that somebody's stealing something in the back of the store. So there is that too. But there is also this part, and I think he was starry-eyed. He really wanted to be in Congress. The photos of him the first day that he went to freshman orientation are so striking that you're like, wow, this is like a child at his first day of school. You're like, wow, he was really excited to be there. And so he might have, and the cautionary tale is, for everybody, all of us, the story you want to believe may not be the true story. And so we try to check each other on that throughout the book, but it's for everybody. The story you want to believe about any politician, the story you want to believe about the people working for you, check yourself from time to time, I think is a really good piece of advice.
So was there any political fallout ultimately from this fraud case? I mean, beyond the individuals who were involved? I mean, I know it's a heavily historically Republican area, but was there any voter backlash? Did any kind of reforms emerge from it?
The district wound up strangely. So Democrats celebrated when Mark Harris stepped down and did not run again in a special election that happened after he had admitted to his role. So he decided, I'm not going to run again. So then there was quickly a hurried special election. Interestingly, the person who was elected in that, after Democrats were celebrating their victory in this, the person who was elected in that was a Republican who was far more conservative than Mark Harris in many ways, which is a kind of an interesting.
And won with a greater percentage of the vote in the special election. So actually, I mean, the answer really to your question is no. There was no political ramification for the Republicans. There were some reforms, and it's interesting. There were some reforms implemented to kind of strengthen the absentee ballot process a little bit. And then some that were cheered on really by everybody. We have a Republican-controlled General Assembly, House, and Senate. And the Republicans went along with them. The Democrats cheered them on at the time. And then within the last year or so, Democrats started attacking some of these reforms that were implemented in response to the 2018 election. But I mean, by and large, I think the answer is, was there any real lasting consequence in North Carolina? No. They didn't schedule McRae's trial for more than 2 years. They didn't even schedule it. They finally got around to it just after the 2-year mark. And so no.
I mean, and the same cultural battles are still happening. We live in a state that's 40-some% people of color, maybe 30% Black, and we're going into this election with one incumbent who is Black, like in out of 14 districts. That's certainly not representative of the state. So there are still the cultural battles happening throughout the state, trying to gain representation, and it's I would say that in many ways nothing has changed. And a lot of folks have forgotten about it. And some folks, one of the frustrating things for me and Nick is we know McRae Dallas, and he has become sort of a caricature of
the boogeyman
fraud. Yeah. And so every time somebody mentions election fraud, he becomes the person whose face becomes popped up. And they're like, look, this is your face of election fraud. And we know him a little bit better than that. And so, we know him on a deeper level than that. And I'm not saying he's innocent. He's not, but we it's kind of like you had a different relationship. You get to know somebody so well, and you're like, gosh, is this my coworker lying to me for so long? Like,
but bottom line, he's become kind of both the scapegoat and the guy, the one dude who encapsulates or is become the face of all of these, structural problems that are, wrong with not necessarily our election system, but society.
Yeah.
It's inevitable, especially if you're a character like he is, and you were at the crux of the entire fraud. So,
yeah. And and to go back to 2016, and this is something to be cautious of, as we go forward, and a lot of election fraud claims are made by politicians throughout the country. When he was brought up in 2016, the governor at the time brought him up and used him in a way to try to prove a point that election fraud was happening and that it was enough to overturn the governor's race. And what ended up happening, the only person who lost in that, I mean, the governor and his attorneys had found the perfect guy to come and take his claim to the State Board of Elections. And so McRae shows up, and lawyers twist him and turn him, and he winds up admitting that he's the one to get, doing.
He takes the Fifth Amendment, pleads the Fifth Amendment in response to a question. Yeah.
But so what I get frustrated with, and I know Nick does too, is when I see powerful politicians use one story to try to verify their claim of fraud, and then that person is usually the one who winds up being hurt the most. And again, he's not innocent, but the charges never seem to rise to the top, to the politician. They always rise to the person doing the hand-to-hand work.
Audience question here. How do you feel in general about the state of voting security in the U.S. after all the research you've done? And I might just add maybe a specific question to that. I mean, the case does seem to point to vulnerabilities in absentee voting. I mean, does it suggest that maybe some conservative concerns are valid?
It could. The answer is yes. There is, and this is kind of an unpopular statement, there is election fraud in America. It happens. We wrote about it, right? And maybe the biggest, truest case. And we know that there are other true cases of election fraud all over the country. Where the rubber meets the road, though, and where you need to drill down then is it widespread enough to call into question our system of elections in America? And the answer to that is probably no. But I would also say the election systems work fine. What don't work, and this is what I was talking about a couple minutes ago, but doesn't work is the system for enforcing our election integrity laws. And, you've got to have a staff capable of properly investigating these things. You've got to have prosecutors willing to bring these cases. You've got to have a court system that can actually adjudicate these cases. And I mean, look here where we have this. It took a long, long time for all of those things to line up. And we still haven't had a court system that can properly adjudicate it because they still haven't been to trial. And so what I think is working significantly less than our voting system is our legal system and the system that's supposed to be holding these laws in check and the parties involved in our elections in check.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, I didn't walk away from our book hopeless at all. I think that American election systems are very strong. I think that it takes a lot of work. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to move 400 votes, and that's that's quite a bit. And so I do think it's important that we don't lose faith. I think we're talking. We're especially with everything going on in the world tonight. We need some American resolve, and we need something to believe in. And democracy is that thing, right? Like it is the thing, right? Or that we can do, that people have a say here. And so people do have a say. We just need, like Nick said, we certainly need our court system to either be better funded or to not be so driven by politics, things like that. We do need our systems to work, but the laws are in place for it to work. I mean, this country should work.
One final audience question. I think this is maybe a good way for us to wrap up. First complimented you on a great conversation, and the viewer wanted to know, what can I do as a regular voter to make sure nothing fraudulent happens in my district? Is there anything I can do?
I think it really comes down to being engaged in the process and paying attention. We certainly don't need vigilante election police running around. I'm not suggesting that's what the audience member was suggesting. But things happened in Bladen County because no one really followed through on the complaints. And if more people in the public were paying attention and putting pressure on the elected officials and the government officials to do what they were supposed to have done, they could have stopped this before it ever blew up to upend a congressional election. And so I think the best thing that you can do is just be an engaged voter and pay attention to elections. Someone paying attention from outside Bladen County would have easily been able to tell this pattern of ballot harvesting that seemed to pop up. I mean, Mark Harris's son, John, could tell. But not enough people were watching and not enough people were taking it seriously. And so I think the best defense to any time our elections are coming under attack is just an engaged voter. And I think that's the way you defend against this.
To question yourself, I think. I mean, there's some, question your beliefs, question the people that you're electing. Nick and I have very different political backgrounds from where we grew up and things like that. We arrived at the same place. We're reporters, and our saying is, we don't trust anybody. Like, we don't trust any of them. Like, I've been lied to enough by politicians over the years that it's really, really hard to trust a politician. So, question your politicians, question the ones especially that you believe most in, I think is probably a really good piece of advice. And, but also trust that, and one of the things that we haven't touched too much on, and if you read the second part of our book is in 3 parts, also trust this: things were a lot worse a long time ago. I mean, that is like, when you talk about vigilantes showing up at the polls, vigilantes took over the polls in Wilmington in 1898 in North Carolina. I mean, they shoved poll workers out with guns.
In a coup, in a real coup on American soil.
Wilmington massacre, right?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. And that's in our book. I mean, the whole story of that is in our book. If we think our press is partisan today, you should see the cartoons that were, I mean, you should see what the newspapers in North Carolina did to escalate some of the white supremacy movement.
Yeah, in service specifically to disenfranchising Black voters.
Yeah.
And I do, you know, it's really easy, I think, to read the headlines today and say, really, our democracy and our country is on the brink of collapse, right? But then I was having one of those moments, whatever was going on, when I was recording the audio book version of our book, and whatever was going on at that time. And then as I was reading it again, and there's just something about reading out loud, right? And really makes you process and think through it even more deeply. And it was a reminder that our country has really been in dark, dark times. I mean, part 2 of the book starts at Reconstruction, so just after the Civil War, and it goes all the way up to the early 2010s. Part 2 does. And so it catalogs some of the worst parts of American history. And our country was strong enough that it got through that. And ultimately, our systems of government were strong enough that they prevailed through that. And so that goes for elections. If we could get through that, we can get through the election shenanigans that we're talking about now. And more broadly, it gives me hope that our country will survive and thrive after we get through the period of tumult that we're in now.
Yeah.
Well, Michael and Nick, we can't thank you enough for being with us tonight. Their book again is The Vote Collectors, the true story of scamsters, politicians, and preachers behind the nation's greatest electoral fraud. And as we've just discussed, that's not hyperbole. And as always, we encourage you to buy it at your local independent bookstore or on bookshop.org, which supports independent bookstores across the country. Michael, thank you again. Nick, thank you. It's been great. Again, I think we could talk another hour. I would love to, but we run out of time. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.